Angelo, by the way, for those of you that don't know, we've been talking about Dick Jackson being a public health hero, but for the work he's done for the county, the biggest environmental health department really at the municipal level in the United States. I think perhaps New York City be about the same size, but it's really amazing, and we're so fortunate to have such an inspirational leader. So let me start with a bit of a historical perspective, and that is that oftentimes the changes that we make in the built environment to solve today's problems lead to tomorrow's problems. So we had the scourge of the Industrial Revolution, where there were so many people living cheek and jowl with industry, living in crowded conditions in the inner city. And the response eventually to that was to segregate land uses, make them further apart from each other, to put people in suburbs and industry and other locations. And that created the problem that Dr. Jackson identified, urban sprawl and public health. And all of the ills of that. Now we're shifting and the pendulum is swinging back so that we're intensifying the density of our development in many areas of Los Angeles and around the world as another purported solution. But this doesn't come without a cost. And the cost there is that as we increase the densities, we increase sometimes the cost of housing, so we're leading to increased gentrification. We reduce the amount of green space that's available. We increase the traffic risk, the noise, and the air pollution risks. So I think, the big question here, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, I think we have to do this, but how do we think longer term so that trying to solve today's problems doesn't present new problems in the future? And I think there are ways that we can work around that, but that's certainly one issue that when you look historically, every time we try to make one of these major shifts, and there have been many of them over the last 150 years, we do end up causing other problems. So how can we be more anticipatory about the types of problems that might evolve if we start doing major changes? I think, too, we have to recognize, and I said this at the start of the day, the broader backdrop to community design right now is tremendous uncertainty. And this includes climate change, which Dr. Frumkin so eloquently outlined all of the implications of for heat, for flooding, for migration, for displacement. The rise of the so-called neo-right and what that's doing to the political structures and forcing a lot of deregulation, particularly at the federal level. But that's going to trickle down, and it's going to have effects that go all over the globe. And then highly disruptive and unpredictable technologies like bird scooters, like autonomous vehicles that are really going to change the shape of our cities, whether we like it or not, because all of the world's biggest corporations are piling money in there hand over fist because they see the potential of profit. So it does present particular challenges when we're operating in such an uncertain environment, but I think it also provides us with tremendous opportunities. So one of those opportunities, for example, if we implemented autonomous vehicles properly, we wouldn't need to park cars in the city. Right now, we devote about 34% of the urban landscape to storing or moving cars. So if we got rid of all of that parking area, I don't know the exact number, but it's probably about 18% of the urban landscape. What are we going to do with that? That's a huge opportunity to green, to have affordable housing, to have better pedestrian infrastructure. So how do we think, well, what's going to happen? And I get the sense now, unfortunately, and I say this with all due respect to people from municipal government, that these technologies are rolling out, and it seems as though, the municipalities just are not thinking far enough in advance and thinking, well, what do we need to do to first ensure public safety so that people aren't falling all over bird scooters? My student, Jonah Lipset, actually he was taking a picture of something walking along and tripped on a bird scooter. So he actually has a video of himself falling down over a bird scooter. And he's a fairly able-bodied young person. What does that mean for somebody that's elderly? So I think that's we have these advantages that we can think through what's coming down the line. We can see it's going to be autonomous vehicles. We're going to have all these new personal mobility devices. how do we start thinking about the health implications of that and being much more anticipatory and trying to harness the benefits rather than just live with all the costs? So what can we do when we think about being more anticipatory? So what can we do? Better predictions. So Dr. Frank talked this morning about having scenarios that he's working up software so that we can see what's going to happen to health indicators when we do change park access, when we do change the pedestrian environment. What's that going to do to diabetes, to obesity? We know those numbers are going to be quite fuzzy, but they're going to be a heck of a lot better than what we've been making decisions on so far. And then how can we harness new technologies to make our cities a lot smarter and do that a lot faster? And one of the things that I haven't seen anybody doing this, but we almost need a compendium of leading practices around the world. You know, this would be another way that we could gather information, because just as I gave the example of the green wave in Copenhagen, where they have sensors embedded in the bike lanes so that they give priority to the bicycles over cars. It's a wonderful thing if you're recycling over there. There are all kinds of those innovations that could happen, and they're not happening very quickly. So what do we do? And Dr. Frank said, well, we need to emphasize the economic benefits. I agree, but I think the health benefits are another very strong leveraging aspect. And also, there is a convenience benefit. You know, if we can get cars moving more smoothly because we've got a better traffic infrastructure and we reduce air pollution as a result, and we reduce obesity because people aren't sitting in their cars as much, that's a great thing. So, you know, those are some of the things we can do. And I think when it comes to gentrification, when it comes to greening, we need to be thinking about quantitative, measurable measures of ways of measuring progress. So, for example, for greenness, we could say, and we have satellite imagery that can give us this very precisely, you know, how green an area is. It's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. We now have satellite imagery that operates at about a one meter scale. So you can get individual trees or LiDAR. And we could say, if you're going to develop this property, you have to make it 20% greener, period. Don't care how you do it, it has to be 20% greener when you're done. And that includes the building footprint that you're about to take, you know, so you've got to do a lot in the neighborhood or around the building, and the responsibility for you as a developer doesn't just stop at the property line anymore, because you have to show that within a given area that your property is, that you're going to make the area greener, and we want a quantitative measure of that. I think I heard a lot about, you know, the difficulties in coming up with one-size-fits-all solutions. And Charles really brought this to the fore in his talks. I thought that was terrific. And we really need, and Anastasia too, we need to focus on the sensitive, vulnerable subpopulations. So we need to ensure the elderly, the children, people in racial ethnic minorities that are socially disadvantaged are the ones that are being represented in the planning process. And if they can't give voice to it, we need to put systems in place that ensure that we don't need to always go to court, that there has to be some sort of public advocate that's there for them in the planning process, because we know that people with fewer financial resources and lower educations are going to have a much harder time pushing that political agenda forward. And, you know, we're fortunate to have Robert Garcia and other people that are doing amazing work advocating for people in disadvantaged communities. Making these issues into civil rights issues is a very powerful way to go. So I think that's another, when we look to the future, we need to, he's done a lot of work for parks and recreation, but what about all the disadvantaged communities that don't have sidewalks? The disadvantaged communities that are, where they're getting hit by cars at rates that are 2 or 3 times more than they are in white and wealthy communities. Those are also civil rights issues. It's a basic right to be able to walk freely around and to experience an environment that's free of hazards, or at least as hazard-free as somebody that's wealthier. So that's, I think, another important step that we have to move toward. I heard a lot about community partnerships and not a lot about crowdsourcing. And I think the two are inextricably linked. And by having a deeper connection with the local community and involving them, it's going to, I think, reduce the NIMBYism that is getting in the way of things like higher density around transit development. Because if people are feeling their voices are heard and they're feeling that they're part of the process and part of the solution, their opportunity to participate is going to probably reduce their willingness to oppose. And that's something that I think, moving forward, when we think about designing healthy communities, we have to look for those leading practices where people have been integrated into the planning process in a very intimate and connected way. But we also need to harness the amazing potential of crowdsourced data. And I've been really fortunate to work on a project with Paul English and Edmund Cito and with Luis Olemo at Comité Civico de Valle in Imperial Valley. And we've established the world's first and biggest community air monitoring network. So we have 40 monitors. It's a very impoverished community that experiences a lot of high air pollution from agricultural burning and from dust storms. And when we started, the government agencies wouldn't even allow us to co-locate our cheaper monitors with theirs because they felt we were a threat. By the time we rolled out 40, they were falling all over themselves to give us money. And the California Air Resources Board is now giving us money to sustain the network because the NIH grant that we were working on has run out. But that's an example where we had a very enthusiastic, engaged community partnership, and the data was basically being generated by the community. They volunteered. We paid some of them to go out and set up the monitors, but a lot of it was done on a volunteer basis. The amount of information that we have from people carrying cell phones, from doing a lot of on-the-ground work. Tina Battiati has developed software where you can do pedestrian audits of the area, and you just need to crowdsource that, and you have tens of thousands of people. It's a level of information that we'll have to make decisions if we start harnessing the power of the public and engaging them. Gives us a huge resource that really doesn't cost that much. So that too is another vision I think that we have to work toward in the future. Another theme that I think that came through today in almost every talk, or the majority of them, is safety. Right now, American cities are not very safe places for a lot of people. And this was, in Charles' talk, the way that people wouldn't, even want to wear lipstick when they're walking around. I mean, that was just a stunning statement to me. And I think looking at the elderly people, that they're not feeling safe because the sidewalks are so banged up. The safety issue for children as they're going to parks. We have to find ways to make our cities safer. And they're not very complicated. To have better sidewalks, to have better infrastructure, to have better lighting, to have better infrastructure for your roadways that's going to automatically slow the cars down so that they're not going to be so out of control when they hit someone. And we've had a tremendous growth in very high performance vehicles, and as somebody that's out bicycling all the time, it scares the heck out of me when I get a Maserati going by me at 60 miles an hour on a residential street, but it happens all the time. And it's because there's not a speed hump there to slow them down. So those types of infrastructure improvements are going to lead to safety improvements that will have huge benefits. And if we look at the United Kingdom and some of the other European countries, they've cut pedestrian fatalities in half in the last 10 years. And one of the main reasons they've done it is they've been very aggressive with traffic calming, but they have speed radar everywhere. And I know that raises a lot of people's backs. They think, oh, we're going to lose our privacy. All it's going to do is give you tickets when you're even 3 miles over the limit. And I know I just got one in Spain a little while ago. So that type of improvement has to be done, and there are places that have already done it. And meanwhile, in America, pedestrian injuries up 20% in the last 2 years. And some of that is probably distracted drivers and pedestrians always looking at their phones, but it's also because the infrastructure isn't there to promote the safety. So we need the safety infrastructure, and it has to be hard infrastructure because our police are too busy doing policing of more serious matters to ask them to do all of that. I think, and this is, Angelo, I appreciate your enthusiasm, and I agree that we have a lot of evidence to do what we know we should do already. But there are always going to be those questions when we base everything on observational studies. The recent study, and Robert Garcia was saying that he appreciated this, where we showed that the brain images of children growing up in greener areas were different, and the brain structure was more likely to promote attentiveness. Those studies are great, but I can't definitively say that it was the greenness. There could be many other factors that are associated there that we weren't able to control for. So we need to move, when we think about the research, to quasi-experimental designs, natural experiments. So when Dr. Frank presented this morning and he showed us, 32% increase in physical activity, 30% decrease in time spent in cars. Those are just stunning numbers, and that was for one greenway. And those are the kind of things that it's very hard to argue with that kind of data, right? You're starting to approach a randomized trial if you do the statistics correctly, and you can infer causality with much greater confidence so that all the doubters and the naysayers and the people that would be against having a greenway or having better infrastructure in our built environment are going to be up against a big wall of mountainous causal data. So that's something that I think going forward, and the National Institutes of Health, led by the National Cancer Institute, to their credit, they've been pushing this agenda. It's still very hard to get funded through that program, as I've had several recent rejections. But it's there, and we need to encourage more of that kind of research. And Tina Battiati is doing part of her thesis on a before and after a bike share intervention. And we may not get much on the bike shares because everybody's using electric scooters, but I think we might have the first before-after study of electric scooters. So we'll figure that one out. But that type of quasi-experimental design is incredibly important for making our evidence base stronger. And then finally, turning to what Dr. Ong talked about, the gentrification, it's clearly a very vexing issue, and I think Dick Jackson pointed out, yes, we want better municipal infrastructure, we want better services, we want better parks, we want better we want better housing, all of those things. But when they start to push people out that have lived there and we don't have any other plans for what those people can do, it's creating a huge social problem, and one that's exacerbating the already growing inequalities that we're seeing. So I think it's difficult to deal with gentrification through market settings, and I appreciate the work that's being done to try and work with the private sector, but we're going to have government intervention, and it's going to have to be quantitative targets. And those quantitative targets could mean, well, if you get 2 extra stories on your building, 25% of that building has to be affordable housing. Period, full stop. No negotiation, nothing. And I think if all of the developers are faced with that, they won't mind it, because they're still going to make more money in the end. And Dr. Garcia told us about something that's happening that I thought was very disturbing, that if you do add affordable housing, the developers are now required to include a certain amount of green space and parks in their developments. They don't have to include that green space anymore because they've included affordable housing. So what are you going to do? You're going to create more housing for people that are socially disadvantaged without any infrastructure to promote physical activity around them. So we need to have, when we look at the 827 bill, quantitative indicators that go into that so that there's going to be affordable housing, and there's not going to be an allowable trade-off for green space or any other infrastructure. It's going to have to be done so that if they get the density bonus, they're also going to have to pay for it in socially beneficial ways. So those are just a few of my thoughts. I think it's been just a wonderful day. I couldn't have imagined it going better. I want to thank everybody that's been organizing it. Tina Battiati has really taken the lead. And Adeline Lowe, Nancy Arroyo, Tiffany Young, Jackie Contreras, they've all played such a great role in helping to organize this, and to all of our co-sponsors, too numerous to name, but they're all up there. Many thanks again, and to all of our great speakers. I mean, what a day! And I agree, Angelo. That first hour was one of the best I've ever seen. So, having all three authors of Urban Sprawl and Public Health was a true honor. So, thanks everybody. We have a nice reception, some good food, some wine. Please stick around and enjoy yourselves and network.